It's a truism in the spiritual life and in the moral life that if you struggle with a certain kind of vice, you should work on the corresponding virtue. All of the vices we know do well to be paired with certain virtues that can help us get out of the holes that we dig ourselves into. If you struggle with pride, like I do, you might want to practice the virtue of humility. If you struggle with selfishness, perhaps the virtue of generosity may be what you need. If you're an impatient person, one that is prone to rash judgment, maybe a good dose of patience is exactly what you need. In the spiritual life and the moral life of the church, we have all of these corresponding virtues that help us address the vices that we struggle with. That's great. But I think there are two virtues in particular that many of us forget to practice that I think today's gospel helps us address. So let's focus in on those two, because I hear it a lot from people who struggle in the spiritual life, and I think that they might do well to attend to these two virtues. The first one comes with the first anecdote, the first story that Jesus gives about how we do not know the hour when the robber will come and knock on the door or break into the house to surprise us. So similar to, he says that God or the Son of Man will also come and surprise us. The virtue that undergirds this disposition that Jesus is speaking about is the virtue of vigilance. To be vigilant in the spiritual life is not a foregone conclusion. Many of us quickly tire of the urgency that accompanies being a disciple of Christ. Perhaps at one point in our lives we felt great urgency to give witness to Christ, but as time goes on, we grow very tepid and comfortable in the faith and very comfortable in our walk with Christ, where we lose that sense of urgency. And what does he say? You don't know when, my brothers, that I'm going to come back. You don't know when I'm going to be knocking at your door. We don't have to think in terms of apocalyptic literature. You don't know when the Lord is going to speak to you on the streets, in your jobs, in your families. Be vigilant. Don't be tepid. Similarly, there's another virtue that's at play in the second part of today's gospel that I think is lacking in many of us modern-day Christians. Oftentimes, I hear people struggling with the sin of laziness, often called sloth when it comes down to its capital name. I struggle with sloth, Father, or I don't do what I should do. I find myself wasting so much time sitting on my couch, scrolling through Facebook, watching too many sports, and not doing what I'm supposed to. What do we hear the Lord speak about? He speaks about that steward who does his task with this second virtue, which is the virtue that Thomas Aquinas points out as the remedy to sloth, which is diligence. It's another great virtue that is underappreciated and underdeveloped in many of us. To be diligent in the faith is saying, similarly with urgency, that I'm not going to take things slowly. I'm going to be dedicated and diligent to do the will of the Father. Dante, in his great Divine Comedy, when he outlines the afterlife in terms of the 7 capital sins and then their corresponding virtues in purgatory, when he speaks about the sin of sloth and its remedy by diligence, he gives a wonderful example in purgatory, and the example to those there suffering is precisely Our Lady. What does he point to? He says, if you struggle with sloth, notice that Our Lady, when she receives the beautiful, wonderful news that comes from the angel, what does she do? She gets up in haste to go preach the good news to Elizabeth. So too with us, my brothers, we are called to be diligent preachers of the gospel, not people who are just kind of waiting for the opportunity to present itself. No, we are evangelists. We must in haste get up to proclaim the good news, lest we find ourselves on the night that the Lord returns, sleeping, lazy, and not willing to respond to his call.